Goedemorgen allemaal en welkom bij inmiddels alweer de 6e lezing van de SIDI-informatiereeks. Heeft u de eerdere lezingen gemist of wilt u die gewoon terugkijken? Dat kan op de verschillende SIDI-kanalen, bijvoorbeeld op het YouTube-kanaal van SIDI, SIDI TV. Vandaag zouden we eigenlijk Grisha Jakubovic te gast hebben. Helaas is hij verhinderd. Zijn lezing zal in plaats van vandaag op 24 maart plaatsvinden. Maar gelukkig hebben we een zeer interessante vervanger vandaag. Vandaag hebben we Elliot Chofoff, politiek en militair analist. Zijn lezing zal in het Engels gaan over Hezbollah en de situatie voor Israël aan de noordgrens. Mr. Chodoff, thank you very much for joining us. And I would like
pleasure.
to give you the floor.
Thank you. What I'm going to be talking about today is first what's happening along Israel's northern border at the moment, but really to understand it and to understand the intricacies, I'm going to take us back to different periods, including some of the background on Hezbollah, which I think will help us understand better what is happening precisely today and maybe a bit of insight into the future, although it's very hard to predict. And in the Middle East, anybody who tries to predict beyond a couple of hours is getting himself into a lot of trouble. If you've been following the news this past week, the Israeli Air Force staged a 3-day surprise, that is surprise for the pilots and the operators, surprise exercise that simulated a war with Hezbollah in the north. And its essential purpose was to do two things for the Air Force, but also something diplomatically as well. For the Air Force, it was an exercise to prepare for a surprise situation where the Air Force would have to go from normal alert, because here I think it's important to understand that Israel doesn't operate the same as many countries in the world between dichotomy of war and peace. We operate between what we call routine and emergency, because peace is something we haven't really achieved yet. So routine is just the normal security situation that goes on from day to day. Emergency is when it escalates beyond what the routine forces can handle. So part of the question is always, if routine goes to emergency very quickly, and I guess the best tragic example of it for Israel was Yom Kippur 1973 with a surprise attack. Suddenly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on October 6, 1973, Israel went from routine to emergency instantaneously. And how do you go as quickly as possible from one to the other? Given that it takes time for the ground forces to get organized, much of the weight of that will fall on the Air Force in the initial stages. So part of what was practiced in the Air Force this week was how do you go from routine to emergency in the shortest period possible, getting as many aircraft into the air as possible, as quickly as possible. The second thing that was practiced, exercised, was how many strategic targets of Hezbollah can be taken out and how quickly, primarily because, as we learned in the war in 2006, and I'll talk a bit about that a little bit later, the ability to eliminate Hezbollah's missile capability early on, or at least reduce it significantly early on, has a tremendous effect on Israel's civil defense capabilities. And one of the things that was announced, and anytime the military announces something, there's always a reason for it to be being made public, is that the Air Force showed its ability to destroy 3,000 targets in a 24-hour period, which is an impressive number. Even in an exercise, of course, reality never matches an exercise. I can tell you in my decades of serving as an officer in the IDF, we never lost an exercise. there's a wonderful political cartoon, a political ideological cartoon from the United States decades ago of a physicist standing in front of a blackboard with a very, very elaborate formula starting at the top and working all the way down to the bottom. Lots of Greek letters and superscripts and subscripts. And in the middle, there's an asterisk, a star, and down at the bottom it says, miracle occurs here. So sometimes we have that feeling in exercises as well. In any event, this exercise went on for 3 days. In addition to its military purposes, there was a very important additional purpose, and the reason it was done this week is to send a message to Hezbollah that it should not try to escalate along the border. For the past couple of months, there have been increased incidents, increased pressure by Hezbollah along the northern border, and we've been dealing with them. You probably haven't heard about them because we have a general rule that when nothing really happens, we don't publicize it. And when we succeed in stopping something in a total fashion, we don't publicize it. But we've noticed a gradual escalation along the border, and Hezbollah has said outright that their intent is to heat up the border. One of the messages that we've wanted to send to them is, don't think that you can do this and remain completely secure in terms of our response. And for this, we need to go back a little bit in understanding what's going on. We had a war with Hezbollah in 2006. I'm not going to go deeply into the machinations of what happened during that 5-week war, other than to say we didn't perform as well as we could have or should have. I'm talking about the IDF. And that gave Hezbollah a message that it could engage us and engage us successfully. From a point of view of peace and security, that's a bad message because it leaves Hezbollah with the idea that it can actually engage the IDF, and it might bring it to a point of thinking that it's worth starting a war. One of the reasons that that war started is that Hezbollah launched an attack against Israel that it believed would not trigger a war. And this brings us to a very important part of the Israel-Hezbollah relationship over the last 20 years. The theme basically is deterrence. Now, we need to understand Israel does not want to fight Hezbollah. Israel wants to be left alone. Israel has no strategic purpose, I'm talking about grand strategic purpose, in eliminating either Hezbollah or any of our state or non-state neighbors. They, on the other hand, have a strategic objective in eliminating Israel. This dates back to its origins, and Hezbollah goes about it in a number of different ways. I'll mark it sort of in the strategic and the tactical. The strategic is that they're building up force, an enormous amount of force, in order to engage Israel in full-scale warfare. The second level, which it used to great extent up until the year 2000, when Israel pulled out of Lebanon, and then to a lesser extent up until 2006, were small-scale attacks that can be alternatively referred to as guerrilla warfare or terrorism. I don't like the term terrorism because it's too politically loaded, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's hard to define. But let's just call it small-scale attacks. Israel is trying to prevent both. In other words, both the small-scale attacks and Hezbollah's ability to reach a point where it thinks that it can launch a major war with Israel, either alone or more likely in conjunction with Iran. In order to prevent both, Israel takes initiative action against Iran's attempts to increase Hezbollah's capabilities, and at the same time threatens Hezbollah that if it launches low-level, small-scale attacks we will punish it by hitting additional targets and keeping it from gaining anything, even if it succeeds. And here, to clarify a point, any organization, or Hezbollah is certainly a capable organization, can succeed in killing a few people. Okay, if you even go back to the 1960s and 1970s in Europe, the terrorist organizations of the time, whether it was Baader Meinhof or the Italian Red Brigades, were utterly incompetent organizations. They failed miserably, but they were capable of killing people, kidnapping people. In other words, in 5 attempts, in 10 attempts, in 15 attempts, they would get a success. And what I would call a tactical success, because they gained nothing in the long run from it. Hezbollah certainly has the capability to kill people. It can launch rockets into Israel. It can fire across the border. It did it to a certain extent between 2000 and 2006. Since 2006, it has not. It's kept things very stable and quiet. It has poked Israel. It has made all sorts of attempts to attack Israel forces that are in places that it considers to be disputed, but never to allow things to overflow. Now, the reason for that is that Israel, since 2006, has credibly threatened Hezbollah by saying anything you do can lead to an escalation that is going to cost you heavily. And that's part of our overall deterrence threat to them. And that's worked. What hasn't worked in terms of deterrence is to prevent them from building up, as I said earlier, to a power level where they might be able to inflict serious damage to Israel. Now, in going back through much of the commentary on Hezbollah, and it's something that I've been doing quite a bit of work on in the past 6 months, something very interesting comes up, and you see it in the news reports on a regular basis as well. If Hezbollah doesn't launch an attack for 2 or 3 years, immediately it's referred to as a much more moderate organization. It's gotten involved in Lebanese politics. It is a political organization. It's always been a political organization. And this false assessment of moderation has greatly influenced outside thinking, European leaders' thinking. You may know that a number of European countries have schematically divided Hezbollah into a political wing and a military wing. That's like saying that a country that has a foreign ministry and an army is 2 separate entities, a political entity and a military entity. And that's nonsense, because Hezbollah is led by one person. His name is Hassan Nasrallah, and he leads all the political and military aspects of the organization. He is part of a ruling council called the Shura Council, and under them are all the aspects, the political as well as the military. The division into 2 parts is purely artificial, in my opinion, so that certain governments can deal with Hezbollah and say, okay, we're not going to deal with the military part of it, we're only going to deal with the political part of it. In fact, they're one and the same. They are more than an independent organization, though. They are, in fact, an arm of Iran, and understanding their Iranian connection is also critical in understanding the issues that we're facing along our border today. Much of the reporting refers to Hezbollah as a proxy of Iran. I'm sure many of you have heard that terminology. The term proxy here is a poor application. It's a poor term because a proxy is an organization or an actor that does something that the patron benefits from in a patron proxy relationship. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is actually a subordinate entity to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. And here, I want to unpack a bit of the Hezbollah relationship. When Hezbollah was started, and the fact is that the origins of Hezbollah go back earlier than what the history books will tell us. The history books tell us that Hezbollah was started in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It actually goes back a couple of years earlier to the immediate aftermath of the Iranian Revolution. When Khomeini took over Iran, he created a new political religious concept. And when I say new, this is something that he had written about in the 1960s, published in the early 1970s, and was truly revolutionary. It was the idea that with the establishment of a Shiite Islamic state, the supreme leader of that state would become what is referred to in his terminology in Farsi, a waliyat al-faqih, a jurist to be emulated, who would become not only the supreme leader of Iran, but also the supreme leader of the Shiites around the world. Now, that concept was not universally accepted. It wasn't universally, to this day, it's not universally accepted in Iran, nor is it universally accepted in Lebanon or in other Shiite communities. Some do accept it and some don't. So here, let me just say, and I'm sure you've heard about the talk of the conflict in the Middle East as a Sunni Shiite conflict. It's more precise to refer to it as a Sunni Khomeinist Shiite conflict, because within the Shiite world, there are Khomeinists and anti-Khomeinists. The Khomeinists in Lebanon were organized and recruited to establish the organization Hezbollah, which broke out onto the scene in the 1980s. A core part of their ideology is the belief in the supreme leader of Iran as the representative of Allah through the 12 imams of the Shiites. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep theology here because it's not really that important. If you're familiar with Shiism, you know what I'm talking about. If not, the bottom line of importance here is that according to their religious belief, they take political orders from the supreme leader of Iran. In other words, this is more than a simple political proxy relationship, which Iran has, for example, with Hamas in Gaza and with other organizations. This is a religious commitment to a political leader. Something, by the way, we're not very familiar with in the West, at least not since the 1640s, when the Pope was both a political and religious leader in Europe. The supreme leader's word is religious law and political law. Now, to add to that, the leaders of Hezbollah, and there have only been 3, have all been clerics. By the way, this is the only organization in what we would call the Islamic radical world in which the leader must be a religious leader, not just a political leader. So, for example, the leader of Al-Qaeda today, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, is not a cleric. He's not a religious leader. Osama bin Laden was. Zawahiri is not. The leaders of Hamas was founded by Sheikh Yassin, who was a religious leader. But his successor, Abdulaziz Rantisi, was a doctor. He was not a religious leader. The leaders today are not religious. I mean, they're religious people. They're not religious leaders. They're not clerics. The leaders of Hezbollah have always been clerics by definition. And not only that, they are clerics who were ordained, if you will, in the Khomeinist religious schools of Iraq and Iran. This is all important for us to understand because it means that with all of the independence, and Hezbollah has a certain amount of operational independence, Hezbollah's political ideology and its religious ideology is dictated out of Tehran today by the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Let me just add one other point to this because it's something we're not used to. I'm not particularly up on your politics. But Khamenei is the successor to Khomeini. Khomeini came to power in 1979. In other words, from 1979 to 2021, Iran has only had two leaders. How many leaders have you had since 1979? Many. When I speak to American groups, I know American politics better. Jimmy Carter was president in 1979. America has gone through 6 generations of presidents in the same time that Iran has gone through 2. The stability, consistency of their ideology is in part based on that, because every time you change leader, there's a slight shift in policy and ideology. Here, there hasn't been. Khomeini and his followers he was, and they are, deep-rooted ideological anti-Semites. And that is an important quality that needs to be understood in terms of Iran's perpetual, and Hezbollah along with them, perpetual restatement that Israel is a cancer that must be destroyed. In other words, what we're seeing from Hezbollah and Iran is not a response to Israeli policy. It's a response to Israel's existence. This is core, this is central. In Khomeini's book the book is called Islamic Government, in which he develops this idea of the jurist. The second paragraph on the first page starts with the words, "The Jews have always been the enemy of Islam." By the way, just as a comparison, it took Hitler over 25 pages of a Mein Kampf before he got to the Jews. To summarize what I've said up until now, the Khomeiniist approach is fundamentally and critically anti-Israel, and that brings us now to Hezbollah as an extension of that and what they're doing in Lebanon and how we have to deal with them on a regular basis. Israel pulled out of Lebanon in 2000, under pressure from Hezbollah, but primarily because our purpose in being in Lebanon from 1982 until 2000 was to protect Israel's northern border. It was considered, by the way, in my opinion, mistakenly, but it was considered by the Israeli leadership that that was not being effectively done from Lebanon, and the decision was made to pull back to the Israeli side of the border, something that was certified by the United Nations. We pulled out of Lebanese territory in May 2000. Interestingly enough, Hezbollah at that point began to increase its power. Now, there were many who believed, in Israel as well, that all Hezbollah wanted to do up until the year 2000 was to move to get Israel out of Lebanon. Once Israel was out of Lebanon, Hezbollah then began to build up power, particularly its rocket capabilities, but also its ground fighting capabilities. And the Hezbollah that we faced in the year 2006 was a highly capable military force. In the intervening years since 2006, it's increased in a number of ways. And here, I'm going to sort of bring us closer into where we stand today. First, it got involved in the Syrian conflict. At the request of Iran, Assad is an important component of Iranian strategy in the Middle East. He's also an important link for Hezbollah. They engaged heavily in fighting starting about 10 years ago and over a period of about 5 or 6 years. They lost a number of fighters. The number is not clear, but they certainly lost a number of fighters in the fighting. But the organization gained an enormous amount of combat capability, combat experience, something that it never had before. And the Hezbollah that we are facing today in Lebanon is a highly capable military force. To call it a terrorist organization is totally inadequate. Hezbollah of today is a terrorist army. incidentally organized as brigades, battalions, companies, as a regular military force. Uniform, by the way. They've gotten tremendous supplies by Iran, tremendous supplies of equipment, both high quality and high quantity. The estimate is they started their war in 2006 with about 20,000 rockets. Today, my estimate, which is higher than the official estimate, puts it at about 250,000 rockets. Even the official estimate, which is about 200,000, gives Hezbollah a rocket capability greater than the entire NATO alliance combined if you take the United States out of the mix. In other words, NATO minus the United States has less rocket capability than Hezbollah. That should give you some idea of what we're facing in terms of that. They have, by best estimates today, over 30,000 troops in Lebanon on our border. For those who are familiar with military organization, that's something close to 3 infantry divisions. When we consider the United States has about 12 infantry divisions, we get a sense of the scale of the force that Israel is facing. Among those forces is the equivalent of about a brigade of what they call assault forces, because it is part of their strategy to launch an assault into Israel. We saw the tunnels that we dismantled about 2.5 years ago, part of that strategy. They had dug tunnels under the Israeli border from their side. And when I say tunnels, don't think tunnels of the scale of crawling through on bellies. Tunnels that were wide enough for people to walk 2 or 3 abreast, standing up with full equipment, because their purpose was to put hundreds of fighters into Israel proper via those tunnels. The purpose was to capture Israeli population areas, not large centers, because they wouldn't have the capability to take a city like Haifa, but villages and towns along the Israeli border, and to perpetrate massacres of Israeli civilians, because for them, in their terms, that would be a tremendous success. We found many of those tunnels, by the way. I don't know any professional out there who thinks we found all of them, but we found many of those tunnels. We destroyed a bunch of them. That doesn't mean they've stopped. It means it set them back. So what we're facing today along the border is an extremely well-equipped, well-trained, and well-organized force. As an adjunct to all of that, they are also they've been trying for a number of years to establish an additional front on Israel's northeastern border of the Golan. The Syrian regime has shown its capability of withstanding the rebellion. It's a much weaker regime today, but it's still in power. Assad has managed, by the way, here, I don't talk about my failures of projection, but one of my great successes, and this is online in many of my lectures, from the very beginning, I predicted that Assad would not fall, that he would hold his position. I won't go into all the reasoning here, but thanks to a number of different factors, including the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah, the Syrian regime has managed to hold. The Iranians, along with Hezbollah, are moving to establish a military border along Israel's border with Syria on the Golan in order to provide them with a 2-front capability against Israel that is both out of Lebanon and out of Syria. And at the same time, shipping as much as they possibly can in terms of advanced weaponry to Hezbollah. Advanced weaponry means guided missiles. The missiles they have today, for the most part, are inaccurate, not totally inaccurate, but incapable of hitting point targets. In other words, if they fire a bunch of them into a city like Haifa, they will hit the city, but they're incapable of pointing to a particular building or a particular installation and hitting that with them. Iran is intent on putting much more sophisticated guided weapons into the hands of Hezbollah, as well as greater anti-tank and anti-air capability. And that's something that's been going on now for a number of years. We have been working tirelessly to prevent that. And again, you may see the news on occasion. I don't know how much of this gets out of the Middle Eastern news cycle, but virtually every 2 or 3 nights, Israel is striking Iranian targets in Syria, primarily targets that involve the shipment of arms to Hezbollah. We just had a strike the other night in the area of Damascus that the Syrians reported. This is an ongoing war that we are winning tactically and losing strategically. What I mean by that is that the strikes are succeeding. We are hitting the targets that we're aiming at, and the Syrians are always reporting that they fired anti-aircraft missiles at Israeli planes and chased them away. That's an elegant way of saying they missed. And the targets are being hit and being destroyed. Strategically, it's failing because the Iranians continue to do it and are periodically succeeding in both moving forces deeper into Syria and getting more and more equipment to Hezbollah. The situation that we're sitting on today now is as follows. A much stronger Hezbollah, a strengthening Iran, and here I can say that with the new American administration, we're facing an interesting paradox of strategy and politics. As I'm sure you know, the Trump administration was very hard on Iran. It pulled out of the nuclear arrangement. By the way, it was not a nuclear deal or a nuclear treaty because it was never signed by anybody, but it was a joint plan arrangement. America pulled out under Trump and imposed heavy sanctions on Iran. The new Biden administration has made it clear that it is willing to go back into the arrangement, lift sanctions if the Iranians come to terms, and so on and so forth. In the paradox of strategy and diplomacy, that actually means that the likelihood of a war breaking out in the near future is lower, because appeasement always pushes war off in the short term. But it means that if and when it happens, and it's more likely when than if, it will happen under conditions that are much worse than they are today. Since both Iran and Hezbollah will benefit from America lifting sanctions and making it easier for them to operate in the Middle East in general. So Israel is now left facing this essentially alone. And what we're likely to see over the next weeks and months is a significant increase in Israeli operations in Syria, possibly in Lebanon as well, as both Hezbollah and Iran press Israel harder under the belief, and I think well-founded belief, that they're going to get less pushback from the United States on it. We've already begun to see that happening in Yemen with the Houthi rebellion. Iran pushing further toward establishing its nuclear weapons capability, which it's been doing all along with an agreement and without an agreement. And Israel being pushed further and further into a position where the possibility of an Israeli action or an action on the other side, triggering an escalation that can lead to war, goes up significantly. That's where we're sitting at the moment. I'm gonna pause here, and if there are any questions, field them and take it from there.
Yes, thank you very much, Elliot Chofoff. So As Elliot Chofoff said, if you have any questions, now's the time to ask them. You can type them at the bottom in the Q&A, or if you're watching on Facebook, you can type them in the comment section of Facebook. One thing I would like to ask, you mentioned the tunnels Hezbollah has been digging, and they've been set back because a number of these tunnels have been discovered and destroyed. In the Gaza Strip, we have seen a similar phenomena, where there's now basically an entire wall, both above the ground and under the ground, to deter from tunnel digging.
Yes.
Is there a similar project going on the northern border with Lebanon?
No, it's a very good question, a very important question, because even though the tunnels are being dug both in the north and in the south, as you mentioned, the situation in those two places is very, very different. First of all, the substrate in the Gaza area is sand. And the digging that's done there is done in a very simple, unsophisticated way, by the way, mostly by children, using hand shovels. And essentially what they do is they dig down very deep. They then shore up the sides with concrete. And then they begin to dig horizontally to get under Israel. But every time they make a little bit of progress with the digging, they then create a concrete sort of covering on the inside so they can continue, because sand, being very soft, can very easily collapse. Here I can tell you from work that I did there almost 20 years ago in Gaza, working with some of the engineers, we were trying to come up with all sorts of ideas of how to destroy the tunnels, because tunnels go back to that period. And one of the ideas that was thought of was to drop bombs, and the bombs would cause the tunnels to collapse. These were the days before they were actually closing them with concrete. And one of the engineers said, that's a very interesting idea, but you realize that by compressing the sand, we actually make it easier for them to dig. So it gives you an idea that good ideas can be good ideas, but they don't really work. Given that they're doing that kind of digging, and the great advantage for them of sand is that digging in sand is relatively silent. Okay, think of digging sand on the beach. You dig, you move it. That makes it much more difficult for sensors to actually find the tunnels by digging. And there, the wall that we've put very far down, and with sensors as well, makes that a very effective means of at least making their lives more difficult. I have to say, I'm not a great believer in physical and technological solutions. I think they work to our advantage, but they don't solve the problem. I come from a school of thought that says that there has not yet been the physical or technological device that will stop a determined human being. What stops a determined human being is a more determined, better trained human being on the other side. Okay, but it certainly makes their lives more difficult. It makes it easier to spot them. It allows intelligence to work better, and so on and so forth. The substrate on the Lebanese border is limestone rock, which means that the digging that they're doing there is not really digging, it's excavating. And that, of course, has its own problems that I can give you. Just this I can talk about because it's no longer classified. One of the tunnels that we discovered on the Lebanese border, or let me go back a step. When digging a tunnel, anybody who's seen the movie The Great Escape is familiar with this. One of the biggest problem is, what do you do with the stuff that you take out of the tunnel? Right? Especially if we're talking about an enormous excavation. If you remember in the movie, they put it into sleeves in their pants and they dropped it on the gardens and they raked it in. With sand, it's not that big a problem because it's easy to take sand out and just scatter it on top of all the other sand. But when you're excavating in rock, you end up with an enormous volume of gravel. And you can't just dump it because then you get piles of gravel. One of the tunnels that was dug up north near the town of Metula The entrance point on the Lebanese side was excavated from inside a cement factory. Now, a cement factory has a huge number of trucks coming and going all the time, and many of them bringing limestone gravel in with them. And brilliant idea to cover it up. And they were actually using the trucks were coming in full with material and then coming out with the gravel and dumping it in other places. The intelligence observers on our side were actually watching and counting trucks, and that was how they figured out that something wrong was going on there. So there was a long way around to saying there's no way to put a wall under the border with Lebanon, because again, we're talking about an entirely different substrate. We're finding the tunnels there through a combination of intelligence work and sensors. And here I can tell you the sensors that exist today do not have great scanning capability. In other words, you can't just start at one end of the border and roll along and find the tunnels. But if you know more or less where they are, the sensors will pinpoint the exact location. So the work continues. As I said, nobody I know believes that we found all of them, but there's no physical way to prevent them, at least not at the moment, in a way that we can do it on the Gaza side.
During your lecture, you mentioned the surprise exercise the Israeli Air Force held this week.
Yes.
And you mentioned during the simulation, 3,000 targets were hit.
Yes.
So somebody asks in response to that, is hitting 3,000 targets in one day, would that be enough to eliminate the threat of 200,000 rockets that Hezbollah has?
No, it would not. There's no such thing as a perfect solution in warfare. But, and again, as I said before, I think 3,000 is a very impressive number. I would be very surprised if that could be done in a real-time situation. But a significant number. Here I can tell you that in 2006, within the first 24 hours, the Air Force did destroy all of Hezbollah's long-range rocket capability and a good part of its medium-range rocket capability. So obviously targets would be chosen accordingly, and not just striking the missiles. In some cases, it could be striking command centers, communication centers. Again, I wasn't involved in the exercise, so I don't know exactly what, but I've been in enough to know it's not a uniform kind of a strike. In the first day, you're trying to disrupt as much as you possibly can, and that would be disruptive. Would it stop them altogether from firing? Absolutely not. It would, again, reduce their capability. The larger rockets, the longer range rockets and the more precise rockets are certainly very high on the target list.
Yeah, because somebody is asking, how far can the rockets of Hezbollah reach?
They can reach every city in Israel except for Eilat on the southern tip of the country. Their long-range rockets now can cover virtually the entire population of Israel. I should also mention that the rockets that they have today, those who are familiar with what happened during the war in 2006, 4,000 rockets hit northern Israel. The rockets that they were firing in those days were smaller. They had less explosive capability, both in terms of the size of the warhead, but also in terms of the quality of the explosive. They have a whole different technological quality of explosive today. In other words, their ability to cause damage is much greater today than it was before. And we take that into account in much of what we're doing. I should also mention, I don't know if there's a question about this, but I'll mention this as well. Those who are familiar with Israel's Iron Dome system, which is a brilliant technology, the Iron Dome system will not be effective against Hezbollah because Hezbollah has the capability of firing many more rockets than the Iron Dome system can engage simultaneously. So it will take out what it takes out, but it won't be able to engage everything coming in.
Do you have the feeling that the new White House administration, the Joe Biden administration, recognizes the threat of both Iran and Hezbollah? Do they take it seriously?
I think they take it seriously, and I think there's a question here of philosophy, of political philosophy, which concerns me. Let me start by saying, not only do I believe that they understand that there's a threat, I also believe that the Biden administration is pro-Israel. However, and there's a however in this, pro-Israel does not necessarily mean good for Israel, because you can be very pro-Israel and think you know better. And we've seen this in the past. In other words, those who sit 10,000 miles away and say, we're going to save Israel from itself. So that's one issue. But what I said about political philosophy, I think it requires a bit of explanation. I believe that they can actually negotiate with Iran and come to terms with them. It's an extension of an international relations school called the liberal school. And here, I don't want to confuse liberal and conservative with the liberal school of international relations. They're two different things, although there's some relationship between them. But the liberal school of international relations basically says that wars happen as a result of misunderstanding. And all you really need to do to prevent war is to sit with these people, figure out what their problem is, make them understand that you have no interest in fighting them, and why should they have an interest in fighting you? And essentially that's the school that is now prevalent in the American administration. The European example that I often use is Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement with Hitler of 1938. I firmly believe that Chamberlain was the person who was second most responsible for World War II breaking out. Of course, Hitler is fully responsible. But the important point in that, and I'm sure listeners know the Chamberlain and the Munich story, it was a disaster. It was a mistake. It gave Hitler strategic lands, Sudetenland. It gave him the ability to move forward. I have never heard anyone, including Churchill, ever accuse Chamberlain of being pro-Hitler or pro-Nazi. In other words, the mistake was a mistake of naivete and political philosophy, not of affinity to Hitler or Nazism. Chamberlain fully understood the threat of Nazi Germany. He just handled it in precisely the wrong way. So I don't want to go so far, to say that that's where the Biden administration is, but that is always a problem, that understanding the threat brings you to a solution that actually enhances the threat inadvertently.
Right now there are talks about possibilities of a new Iran deal, a new nuclear accord, possibly, and a possible re-entrance of the United States under the Biden administration. So somebody asks, could perhaps the termination of the subsidies of Hezbollah by Iran be part of these new negotiations, so that it doesn't limit to just Iran's nuclear ambitions, but that it also addresses these other activities by Iran, such as subsidizing Hezbollah?
It could. There are a number of issues with that. First of all, I don't believe that that's on the American radar. Second, as we all know, money is very easily transferred through third and fourth and fifth parties, as are weapons. So even if Iran agreed to it, and I don't believe they would ever agree to it, But even if Iran agreed to it, holding them to it would be very, very difficult. And here I want to reiterate something that I said earlier, and then I'll come back to the question, and that is that Hezbollah is not an external entity from the Iranian point of view. Hamas is, Hezbollah is not. So the idea of cutting Hezbollah off by Iran is, I think, conceptually impossible. I want to give you an idea of how close they are. When Qasem Soleimani was killed by the Americans last year, the Iranians turned to Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, and asked him if he would be willing to replace Soleimani as the head of the Quds force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. You don't do that with a servant proxy. You do it with somebody who's very much integrated into part of your system. An indicator of whether a new American entry into the Iran deal, where it will lead, and I believe that ultimately they're going to go back in. The question is, will they make the same contextual, conceptual mistake that they made in the first deal, in the first agreement? And that is as follows. And you can go, I watched this in real time, and I saw it happening in real time. It's part of what I do. America went from an objective, the initial objective of the negotiations was to somehow put a brake on the Iranian nuclear program. That was the idea. As the negotiations continued, the objective became arriving at an agreement. Now, the minute you shift an objective from getting the best terms you can to making an agreement, you lose. And the Iranians understood it. By the way, the Iranians are excellent negotiators. The Iranians perceived the shift. And the minute they saw that shift, they hardened their terms, they withdrew offers that they had made, and they ultimately got a deal entirely on their own terms because the Obama administration negotiators and John Kerry and friends basically placed coming to an agreement as their primary objective. Now, if the Biden administration makes the same mistake, we're going to end up in exactly the same place. If they go in and make clear to the Iranians, look, we want to come to terms with you, but here are our stipulated points, and these are the ones we're absolutely not willing to negotiate on, then maybe they'll get a better deal out of it. It's too early to tell at this point.
Lebanon itself is currently in a crisis. It's on the verge of bankruptcy. So there are some attempts in the international arena, orchestrated by France especially, to help Lebanon out. How does this involve Hezbollah? What does this mean for Hezbollah, for its influence in Lebanon?
First of all, let's understand, Lebanon has been in a crisis since the 1940s. The crises vary, but it's been in a crisis forever, basically. Hezbollah is only marginally affected by any of this. It has an effect, but Hezbollah's primary interest in the Lebanese state is to provide it with cover for its operations. There's a population in Lebanon that will never accept Hezbollah, and there's a population that will only accept Hezbollah, and there's sort of a group in the middle that sort of varies, going back and forth. But Hezbollah at this point is well established with its own constituency, meaning primarily the Shiites of the south, of the Baqa, and of South Beirut, of the Dakhia area, but also other communities. Some of the Christian community has gone over to them because remember that in Lebanon, there's at least a four-way conflict, and then that four-way conflict then divides up into sub-conflicts. We have the Druze, the Sunni, the Shia, and the Christians. But again, that's way too simplistic, because within those groups, we have subgroups. For example, I mentioned earlier, within the Shia, there are the Khomeinists and the anti-Khomeinists. And they've fought each other. And they've gone in together sometimes. So it's very hard to map that out. As far as aid to Lebanon, I don't think it's going to make a tremendous amount of difference. Keeping Lebanon afloat as a country, I think, has certainly France for its own reasons, but there's an interest in that. We don't want to see a total collapse. We certainly don't want to see a massive humanitarian disaster. But all in all, I think it's important to keep in mind that right now, and this has been the case for a decade or so, Hezbollah is a more powerful organization than Lebanon is a state. Okay, in other words, Hezbollah is more powerful militarily than the Lebanese army. Hezbollah provides more social services to its constituents than the state does to its constituents in terms of hospital care, education, social services, and the like. So as a result, let's call it the marginal shifts of Lebanon being slightly better off and slightly worse off will have very little overall impact on Hezbollah.
Somebody asks, because Iran transfers weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria. But of course, in order for that to happen, it needs Assad as an ally to allow that.
Correct.
So wouldn't it have been of interest to Israel if Assad had been toppled?
No, not necessarily, because one of the important rules that we need to understand, particularly in the Middle East, is that not everybody who opposes a bad guy is a good guy. Sometimes there's worse than the bad that you have. There's also the idea of better the enemy I know than the enemy I don't know. But a Syria that would be ruled by an Al-Qaeda or Islamic State kind of regime could actually have been worse off for Israel than Assad. And a totally fragmented Syria would leave Iran in even greater control than it is today. So the answer is not necessarily. Had the so-called Free Syrian Army, which was also not exactly a Western liberal democratic operation, but had they managed to take power, perhaps. The question is, do you, on the basis of a perhaps, do you undermine a system and have all the other possibilities as a result? Let me give you an analogy. America was certain 17 years ago, 18 years ago, that all they needed to do was eliminate Saddam Hussein and Iraq would turn into a flourishing Western liberal democracy. Didn't exactly work out that way. So I would be a little cautious. For the Americans, they don't care. It's 15,000 miles from home. For us, I can almost walk to Damascus from my house.
Yeah, it's on your doorstep, basically. Yeah. Because that's what somebody asks. Let's say an attack takes place. Hezbollah starts an attack and there's a full-scale war between Hezbollah and Israel.
Yes.
What would happen? What would be the estimated number of casualties be in Israel? And also, what would a new occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel be an option?
Okay, so the answer to the first question is it's impossible to predict casualties. I think anybody who tries to do that is essentially fabricating. Casualties are a function of so many variables. You know, there's a very important saying in strategy, which I firmly believe in, and that is no plan survives the first contact with the enemy. And plans include estimates. Anything could happen. Luck comes into play. There's a dynamic of the fighting. So I don't want to make those kind of estimates because they're too wildly inaccurate. Occupation of South Lebanon, I don't see. I do believe that we will have to go into Lebanon on the ground. I say this not only as an officer in the ground forces. I love the Air Force. As a matter of fact, I am one of many ground forces officers who deeply wish that wars could be won from the air, because that means that we could just stay home and drink coffee while those magnificent men and women fly their magnificent machines. But it has never happened, despite the attempt in 2006 to make it happen. I think that we've learned that lesson, and it's no great secret that in a full-scale war with Hezbollah, we'll need to go into Lebanon with large forces. But that doesn't mean occupy. I think that one of the great mistakes that we made in 1982, when we went into Lebanon to throw the PLO out, was in not understanding, and it's easy to not understand this, that you go from liberator to occupier virtually overnight. And America has learned that the hard way in lots of places as well. They love you when you come in. The population, when Israel went into Lebanon in 1982, the local population that had suffered under the PLO for over a decade were dancing in the streets, throwing rice and flowers at the Israeli tanks, welcoming. A week later, it was what he's still doing here. And of course, I say that with the great knowledge of retrospect. Nobody actually came out and said it. It was just, this sort of gradual decline of relations that by the time you realize you're there, it's too late to deal with it, and other things are going on. So I think we've learned that lesson. So going in for sure, if there's a major war, I say for sure, 99%, there's nothing 100%. But I think that as soon as the fighting ends and plus X days, Israel begins to pull back and not set up any sort of an occupation structure.
Because that's Lebanon, but nowadays Hezbollah is also active on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, and also other Iranian proxies. They're trying to get a foothold on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, right on the Israeli border. So how much activity is there estimated to be there, and how significant would that be if a war would break out?
As of now, at this moment, not very significant. I believe that a planned war, right, because unplanned can happen at any time, but a planned war on the Iranian Hezbollah side will only happen when that is significant. Okay, in other words, one of the reasons that they're not doing it now is because we have so far succeeded in preventing them from establishing significant power on that border. They are constantly attempting, they're building. We're not stopping them, we're slowing them down. So it's a matter of time until that actually happens. But at the moment, it's not an issue. When it becomes an issue, and here I'm not giving away any military secrets, our preparations for the North are a two-front war on the Lebanese and Syrian borders. And we are developing the capability, both in terms of forces and command and control, to be able to do both. It's a situation that Israel has never faced, and that is having two fronts commanded by one regional command. Okay, and let me elaborate on that, because for those who are not familiar with the structure of the Israeli military. The Israeli army is the ground forces, and our operational forces, our ground forces, is divided into 3 regional commands: north, center, and south. North, and as it sounds, the northern command is responsible for the north of Israel, central command the center, primarily the West Bank, and south, Gaza, Egypt, Jordan. Obviously, Egypt and Jordan are not combatants. We have peace treaties with them, peace agreements with them, relations with them, but their territories can be problematic. We've had Al-Qaeda attacks out of Egypt, out of Sinai. There has been terrorist activity out of Jordan, but not with those countries. Still, geographically, Southern Command deals with that sort of that triangle of the Negev to the south. Central Command, and including Gaza, Central Command primarily dealing with terrorist activity in the West Bank today and securing the Jordanian border, and Northern Command, Lebanon and Syria. Never in Israel's history, on a serious basis, has one command had to fight a 2-front war. Israel has had to fight 2-front wars, Yom Kippur, for example, but Southern Command dealt with the Sinai War, and Northern Command dealt with the Golan War. In 1967, Southern Command dealt with Egypt and Gaza. Central Command dealt with Jordan and the West Bank. Northern Command dealt with Syria and the Golan Heights. Lebanon really didn't participate. So we're facing a whole new command issue, which we're facing. We're preparing for it, where a single regional command, in this case, Northern Command, will have to fight in 2 different directions. Needless to say, a great deal of thought is going into that.
Because we have multiple questions regarding if Hezbollah starts attacking, does Israel in the north have enough shelters and safe rooms? And are there other ways that Israel tries to prepare its civil population to protect it from an attack by Hezbollah?
Okay, so the simple answer is no, there's not enough. However, given the Hezbollah capabilities of today, we operate under a civil defense program of what we call as protected as one can be. Okay, now, given the inaccuracy of their weapons at this point, what we basically say is, if you have a safe room, a hardened room, use it. And by the way, there are all sorts of new technologies that can turn existing rooms into safe rooms. In other words, up until a few years ago, you either built a new room or had it built onto the house of reinforced concrete, or you did without. Today, there are technologies of actually turning a regular room into a hardened safe room by using all sorts of new steel technologies, basically, to do that, but still not enough. Having said that, there are safer places and less safe places. So a room with fewer windows, or in a multi-story building, the core of the building, usually the staircase, is hardened just for construction purposes. It should be clear that even safe rooms will not withstand a direct hit by a large rocket. They will withstand a very near miss. So the idea being that even if you're not in a safe room, in a hardened room, if you're in an interior room, or if you're in a room with, let's say, only one window, sitting on the floor away from the window provides a reasonably good protection, not as good as a safe room. And that I mention all this. These are part of the instructions that we give to the civilian population during emergency. By the same token, if you're caught outside during a rocket attack, simply lying down on the ground provides much better protection than standing up. So it was a long answer that basically says no, not adequate, but there are many things that can be done to improve a person's, I'll call it survivability, because it's not really safety when rockets are falling, but improve survivability during an attack. And those are things that when a situation occurs, and we've had this with Hamas in the south, these are things that go on to the news and are being repeated constantly, so that people will have it well forward in their heads of what to do under attack.
Somebody asks, how much political time does Israel have in case of a war to achieve its objectives of as much as possible destroying the capabilities of Hamas? How much political time will Israel have before the international arena will start exerting pressure on Israel to impose a ceasefire?
My guess is not very much. I would count it in days. Another reason why, there are essentially two reasons why Israel learned the hard way in 2006 that you don't take time. And I mentioned 2006 was hardly a high performance example of Israel's capability, in part because the command system didn't understand the urgency of war. It was a 5-week war that should have taken 3 weeks, or even 2 weeks. But there was no sense of urgency. That's been shifted. I believe that as long as Israel is successfully attacking Hezbollah, it will have enough political breathing space to deal with it. Keeping in mind also that even a UN Security Council resolution can take 2 days to implement, 3 days to implement. You can always say yes, but that won't give Israel 4 weeks or 5 weeks. Given the threat of Hezbollah rockets, Israel can't afford to have a 4 or 5 week war. Okay, I mentioned earlier, over 5 weeks, 4,000 rockets fell on Israel in 2006. Hezbollah's plan is to fire 2,000 a day. So our plans can't span 3, 4, 5 weeks. The truth is they don't have to. I believe that we're looking at, if we do it correctly, a week to 10 days at most to deal with Hezbollah. Now, that's a tricky prediction because that assumes nobody else gets involved. It assumes no massive Iranian involvement, etc. But if that happens, your first question changes as well. It's no longer Israel against Hezbollah. It's a regional eruption. But I would say 10 days is a fair guesstimate.
Right, because you say a regional eruption. So how do other Arab states, especially the countries that have recently normalized their relations with Israel, in part because of the threat of Iran, how do they perceive the threat of Hezbollah?
Oh, they see it as a serious threat. Hezbollah is operating in Egypt. Egypt sees them as the enemy. The Gulf states certainly have no use for Hezbollah. The Saudis are fighting the Houthis in Yemen, who are basically a parallel, not perfect parallel, but a reasonable parallel of Hezbollah in Yemen. And by the way, there we've just seen a terrible decision on the part of the Biden administration, essentially cutting off Saudi Arabia and supporting the Houthis against the Saudis. The result has been thousands, in the last week, thousands of dead in Yemen as the Houthis are stepping up their operations. But if we go across Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, will certainly support Israel against Hezbollah. Syria is irrelevant under the circumstances. And if we go sort of further out into North Africa, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria are also equally irrelevant. And Morocco will probably sign on, not that they matter, they're so far away that they don't really make much of a difference. So the Arab world in general, I would say, will support Israel on it.
There's also activity of Iranian and Hezbollah agents in Europe, of which, of course, the most grave example is the terror attack in Bulgaria on Israeli tourists a couple of years ago.
Yes.
So somebody asks, how much does Israel monitor this? And does it also do so in cooperation with European intelligence services? And she also explicitly mentioned the Netherlands.
Okay, so let me expand the point, and then I'll answer the question. Hezbollah is operating everywhere. They have a huge base in South America, both in Venezuela, because Venezuela and Iran are allies, but also in Argentina. There's a large Lebanese Shiite expatriate population there. They're operating in Mexico. They've crossed into the United States in reasonably large numbers. They're operating in Africa, and they're operating in Asia. And of course, as you mentioned, in Europe. And by the way, the Bulgarian operation that the attack, let me see how I can phrase this, was not the most recent attack, it was just the most recent successful attack. And here's a difference between the way those of us in the profession measure things and others measure things. You know attacks when they're reported on the news. We know the ones that we stop. Those are also attacks, they're just unsuccessful. So we track Hezbollah around the world, and we keep as close watch on them as we possibly can. And we do it in conjunction with intelligence agencies around the world, friendly ones anyway. I don't know specifically what our intelligence connections are with the Netherlands. I know they exist. I know that in general, we look upon the Hezbollah threat in Europe and to Europe, because it's not only to Israeli targets, as a threat that we're all facing together. And even in cases where there is not good reciprocity, we are going to give intelligence services the information that we have, that we can give, in order to thwart Hezbollah operations, and not just Hezbollah, Al Qaeda, and anyone we keep track on, simply because it's to everyone's benefit that they have them, even if we get nothing specific in return for it.
You mentioned Hezbollah has a base in South America. So somebody says Hezbollah gets a lot of money out of international drug trade.
Yes.
What is being done against this to stop this source of income?
Look, it's being fought on the international drug level. And as we know, international drug or counter drug operations have not been particularly successful in the grand sense. In other words, yes, every now and then there's an operation that succeeds and arrests some people and confiscates however much it confiscates. But in the overall, Hezbollah, first of all, Hezbollah makes its money on a number of different levels. Drugs is only one of them. They are involved in a great deal of criminal activity around the world, including money laundering, including tax evasions, including smuggling. There was a Hezbollah cell in America that was broken a number of years ago, selling black market cigarettes. In other words, cigarettes are heavily taxed in America. So they were getting cigarettes, stealing them, smuggling them, whatever, and then selling them and collecting the difference. So these are very sophisticated operations. As I said, drugs are part of them. They are very, very well tied into the drug cartels in Mexico. And I mentioned Mexico earlier. Mexico is a very important sort of connection point in all of this, because we don't think of it this way, but a good part of Mexico is not ruled by the Mexican government. And anybody who's followed the drug cartels in northern Mexico knows the drug cartels in northern Mexico are very much like Hezbollah in Lebanon. They control their territory. And Hezbollah feels very comfortable in those kind of sort of state vacuums. So the summary answer is not very successful. Drugs and drug money are among the great failures of, I would say, Western, because mostly it's the West, Western country crime fighting.
Last year, we have witnessed the enormous explosion in Beirut. And not that long after, the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and also the Israeli army, on multiple occasions even, I believe, has pointed to Hezbollah military locations where they develop or produce missiles or missile parts. Has this information, these allegations by Israel, influenced anything in Lebanon?
No, absolutely not. First of all, as I said earlier, Hezbollah is more powerful than the government. So, and this goes back to 1989 with the Taif Agreement. All armed groups in Lebanon were ordered to disarm, and Hezbollah said no, and nobody tried to enforce it. So Hezbollah does what it wants. It may not be able to get away with it in every ethnic group area, but it can certainly get away with it in the areas that it controls. And I think here there's an important additional point to be made. They certainly intentionally place weapons and munitions and factories in populated areas. Knowing, and Hamas does exactly the same thing, by the way, they are not using people as human shields. They're using them as human sacrifices. Okay, because human shields human shields have been used in warfare. They presume, of course, that your adversary has some moral sense of not wanting to kill civilians. And by placing civilians around a military installation or a military installation among civilians, you create a moral dilemma: do I strike this or not? The problem is that if all of your military installations are amongst civilians, you're no longer creating a moral dilemma, because defeat versus killing enemy civilians is not a dilemma. And therefore, what they're doing essentially is guaranteeing that civilians will be killed and injured in the next round of fighting. And that's no longer shields, that's sacrifice. And we've seen that. We saw that in 2006 as well. We've seen it with Hamas in Gaza, where they've actually put civilians into military target areas and did it in a way that we didn't know they were there. In other words, it wasn't even in order to get us to consider whether or not to strike the target. It was to guarantee that civilians would be killed when we struck the target. And that, of course, is done for, I'll call it, for the CNN effect. And Hezbollah is doing exactly the same thing. It's not protecting their facilities. It's in order to endanger the civilians. And you mentioned the Beirut port. The ammonium nitrate that was sitting in Beirut port was sitting there for years. They knew about it. Everybody knew about it. It could have been moved. It should have been moved. It wasn't moved. again, because it was, from a Hezbollah point of view, it was safer there than anywhere else.
So you're saying Hezbollah had a role in the blast?
It had a role in, at least in the passive sense.
Okay. We have multiple people asking about Turkey. What is the role of Turkey in all of this? And is there any way to get Turkey on the Israeli side of this conflict?
Wow. Okay, the answer to, I'll start with the answer to the second question. The answer is no. I don't know if am I freezing or?
You froze for a moment, but you're back.
Okay. The answer is no. Erdogan has essentially revolutionarily dismantled Turkey. And it's interesting, America has been giving him an enormous pass over the years, but watching it from an analytical point of view, basically a few things about Erdogan. Number one, Erdogan is Muslim Brotherhood, and he's part of that network. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. He is an Islamist of the Brotherhood variety. And what he has done in the course of his leadership is gradually but successfully dismantle the secular Turkish state that was established by the Young Turks, the Ataturk Revolution 100 years ago. The Ataturk state was the heir to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire dismantled after World War I. And the idea was to establish a Western-style secular state. It was a very weird arrangement because Ataturk understood that Turkey was a weird place to establish a Western state. Okay, he couldn't build a French-style democracy in Turkey because literally and figuratively, Turkey straddles the Middle East and Europe. And there's one foot in Europe and one foot in the Middle East. So for example, something that most Westerners don't understand, the Turkish method, the Ataturk method, was that the army must remain thoroughly secular. If you were a religious Muslim, you could not be an officer in the army. Very discriminatory by our thinking in the West. But he saw that as a guarantee of secular Turkey. The army had the constitutional authority to bring down the government. In the West, we call that a military coup. In Turkey, that was its constitutional role. If the government became too Islamist, the army was meant to overthrow it and install a new secular government. Erdogan destroyed the army on that level. A few years ago, you may remember the so-called coup. Well, according to the Turkish constitution, the army doesn't need a coup. It can legally overturn the government. Erdogan flipped it. He got the courts to agree to it. The army has now been essentially taken out of the picture. I use the army as the example. He's done it with the Supreme Court. He's done it with all sorts of laws. We now have a Turkey that is one step short of being the Ottoman Empire again. So that's all by design, by the design of Erdogan and his party. So Turkey is a major threat. It's not quite there yet, but it's very close to there. It will be in conjunction and conflict with Iran over the coming years. But I think until or unless Erdogan's Islamic government is overthrown, Turkey is on a path that is not good for Israel or for Europe.
funny that you mentioned Europe, because somebody asked, what could Europe do in supporting Israel?
What Europe can do in supporting Israel is, I would say, first and foremost, understand that Israel is essentially a Western-style country in the Middle East, and it's the only one of its type. This is the only Western liberal democracy in the region. And Europe has, for decades, played a balanced role in its approach to the Middle East. And America has done that periodically, but Europe has done it much more consistently, certainly going back to the 1960s, in saying that there's some sort of balance between whether dictatorial states and Israel or terrorist organizations in Israel. And that balance assessment is the root of a great deal of what ultimately is anti-Israel. What's going on now with the International Criminal Court, although we'll see what happens with the new prosecutor. Leaving aside for a moment the question of jurisdiction, which is a very important question, but leaving that aside for a moment, to say in a document we're going to investigate Israel and Hamas for war crimes, in and of itself is a miscarriage of justice. To paraphrase Churchill, it's like saying we're going to investigate a fire and the firefighters for the damage that they have done. Why not be balanced? The lack of understanding of the inherent imbalance is, I think, where Europe needs to begin in looking at Israel and its surroundings. And from there, I mean, once that understanding is clear, then how Europe can help is also clear. Cutting off funds to terrorist organizations, not accepting leaders like the Iranian leadership calling for the elimination of Israel. I don't know how many people followed. A few weeks ago, the Iranian parliament passed a law mandating that the country destroy Israel. Where was the European outcry? If that kind of behavior or those kind of statements are accepted as okay by European leadership, then basically what they're saying is that it's perfectly legitimate to call for the elimination of a country named Israel. Those are good places to start.
Thank you very much, Elliot Chofoff, for your lecture and answering our questions.
My pleasure.
Dank aan alle deelnemers thuis die hebben meegekeken of dit nog terug gaan zien op een van de CIDI-kanalen. U kunt deze lezing en andere lezingen terugkijken op de verschillende CIDI-kanalen. Wilt u deze lezingen steunen? Dat kan. U kunt hiervoor kijken op onze website www.cidi.nl. U kunt CIDI op verschillende manieren steunen. Volgende week, zoals gewoonlijk op de woensdagochtend, is de volgende lezing van de CIDI-informatiereeks. En dan hebben we Dr. Ras Siemt van het National Security Studies Institute.